Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. A few quick announcements and reminders. We'll be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the recording of the webinar, a PDF of the PowerPoint slides at the end of the webinar. I'll also send information on how to receive and request a certificate of attendance in the chat and also in that follow-up email. I also wanted to acknowledge and extend gratitude for our American Sign Language, or ASL, interpretation services, which are provided by ThinkSelf Minnesota, the Deaf Education and Advocacy's Specialized Interpreting Fellowship Training, or SIFT program. And I'm also very, very excited and grateful to have Mary Willis from DAP, the Domestic Abuse Project in Minnesota, here to provide some information on how to support children's mental health through healthy communication and modeling boundaries. So I'll go ahead and allow her to introduce herself and kind of start her presentation, but thank you so much for being here.
Awesome. Thanks, Brenison, and thanks so much for having me. It's always so much fun to get to partner with you all at Women's Advocates. All right, so I'm going to see if I can get this presentation going. Okay. Good beginning here. I will do a little more introduction once we get this going. All right. Okay, give me 1 second here. I'm just going to see if there is a way for me to be able to view the chat at the same time. There we go. We got to pull up. All right. All right. So let's see. This came up in a kind of a fancy view that I'm having to adjust to. Oh, you can see the presenter's view. Well, that's frustrating. 1 second here, and we will figure this out. All right, I'm going to stop sharing and reshare. Here we go. This should work. Thanks for the technical support, everyone, and thank you for your patience. There we go. Okay. Yeah, thank you for your patience. Well, there's always something, isn't there? Okay, so yeah. Oh, and of course, I just dropped my cell phone. Sorry for the crash. Yeah, so my name is Mary. I am an early childhood therapist at Domestic Abuse Project. I have my master's in mental health counseling from Boston College, and I'm an LPCC, so licensed professional clinical counselor here in Minnesota. In my former work lives, I have previously worked in intensive outpatient programming for kids and teens with various mental health diagnoses. I've also done early childhood day treatment within a school setting. And then I've also done a good amount of outpatient therapy and diagnostic assessments. So I have kind of a range of experiences, mostly grouped around working with young kids and families. And I'm excited to bring those here today to share with you all. And there's a picture of me hiking because it's something I really enjoy doing in my spare time. And you always got to have the puppy photo too. Okay, so I work at Domestic Abuse Project, and I thought I would do a brief overview of what our services look like. So in our youth team, we have 4 main types of services we provide. There's early childhood, so kiddos ages 0 to 6 and their parents. It's a dyadic structured therapy. It's child-parent psychotherapy, if any of you are familiar with that. And we do have immediate openings for those services. So if any of you all have clients who are in the Minnesota area and have kiddos ages 0 to 6 and would be looking for support around processing those traumatic experiences, feel free to reach out to me. And then we also provide group services for around 9 to 12-year-olds, and that's processing trauma, building some coping skills, creating connections with others who've experienced violence. And then we also offer therapy for kids, and that's really ages like 6 to up to 21, using either a child-centered play therapy model or more just a generalized talk therapy model. And then finally, we have a parent caregiver support group that meets on Tuesday nights via Zoom. And it's a very kind of drop-in style. We offer some structured topics and then some more just time to process. And then finally, we also have our victim survivor or women's team. They provide 16-week group therapy services to folks who've experienced violence. And then our intervention prevention team, also called men's team in the past. So we provide a 24-week service for folks who have used abusive behaviors, can be longer sometimes to help. And we also provide a specific group for military connected individuals who have used abusive behaviors, and do have immediate openings for those folks as well. And then finally, we offer case management services, so helping folks get connected with resources and specifically with the coordinated entry system in Hennepin County. So really putting a DV lens on what access to housing could look like. And then our legal advocacy team. So we do safety planning with folks, we do orders for protection, harassment restraining orders. And then we also have a chat line for folks to reach out with just general legal advocacy questions. So we do a lot at DAP. We really do. And part of our mission is to try and provide services for every part of the family that is affected by violence, not just one or the other. So that's why we have so many kind of branches, so many different arms. So the next thing I'd like to do is take a moment to reflect on our identities, and I'll just share some of mine with you. I am white. I identify as queer. I'm a cisgender woman. I speak English. I have a graduate education. As I shared with you earlier, I'm a US citizen and was born here. And I grew up in the Twin Cities area. So those are a few. And my identities, I hold a ton of privilege. I think another one I can name too is being like fairly upper middle class. I'm generally well resourced both throughout my childhood and now. That's another important one. So I want us all to take a moment and think. Oh, and I'm seeing a question, what is cisgender female? Great question. Cisgender means that you identify with the gender you were assigned at birth. So I was assigned female at birth and I identify as female. So I am cisgender. So what I'd like us to do is just take a moment to consider what your identities might be. There's nothing you need to share. This is just a moment of personal reflection. And then how our identities shape the space and how certain privileges we might hold or not hold could create a power dynamic within the space itself. So we'll just pause for a second and think of that. All right, and then what I might ask too is sharing whatever feels comfortable for you, but share some aspect of your identity in the chat. Again, whatever feels comfortable for you. If you'd rather not share, that's just fine. But so thinking of race, gender, age, sexuality, disability status, religion, there's all sorts of different things. And then thinking about whether that's give you privilege and or power, or how this positions you within systems. Yes, and naming that we're in Minneapolis on Dakota land. Thank you. That's very important. And I'm seeing folks are naming their pronouns too. What's a wonderful thing. Oh, yep, and a great reminder too. Before you're sharing things with the group, click the little gray button above the text box, change it to all panelists and attendees, or it'll only be us panelists who can see it. Yeah, thank you for sharing. I'm seeing folks naming their race, naming gender, naming sexuality, what language they speak. Yeah, so thinking those of us who are white, we do hold some power, we do hold some privilege in spaces, right? Because that is the identity that's more valued. And there are lots of systems present in our society that that are built to oppress folks who aren't white, folks, BIPOC folks. Yeah, I'm seeing someone naming that they live in a border city. Yes, that is a completely different dynamic than living in the middle of Minnesota. Folks naming disability status. Yeah, naming socioeconomic status to religion. Thank you all for sharing. I think that is just a really important thing to consider as we move forward. So feel free to keep on sharing as we go. And just please hold these in mind as we talk today, how your identities, how your identities within groups and then out of groups, how that might share what we talk about and how that'll shape the space that we're all creating today. So we're going to go through our learning objectives quickly. First, hoping to define what boundaries are, talk about how they can be used in abuse, and talk about how children's boundaries can relate to their development. Then talk about how grown-ups in kids' lives can use boundaries and can communicate boundaries when kids have a hard time with boundaries, and talk a little bit about flexibility with boundaries. And then finally, thinking about kids' emotional health and regulation and how boundaries can be a support for this, as well as how boundaries can just support this. And then also talking about how can we help kids who really have a hard time with boundaries and what might that mean for them. So I'm hoping we'll get through all that today. I always tend to go a little long on presentations, so I'll try to kind of zoom through. All right, so first let's talk about what is abuse. So I'm guessing a good amount of you are very familiar with the power and control wheel, the Duluth model. So, but still put it up there because I think it is just such a good thing. Always good to review it. So defining domestic violence or domestic abuse, you'll hear me use those interchangeably as a pattern of violence used to maintain power and control against a partner or a family member. And then there is lots of different types of domestic violence that occur. Physical violence is just one. There's also sexual, emotional, psychological, financial, digital, and then violence through system. So using someone's marginalized identities against them and naming that, so that can be a factor. And then systems of power and control are also used as a form of abuse. And then thinking about how can kids be affected by abuse? So kids, this is another version of the power and control wheel, but this is specifically for kids. So kids will, kids see, hear, and feel both fighting and or physical abuse. Kids are often very, very aware of what's going on, although parents try very hard to protect them. Kids are often more aware than we think, more intuitive than we think. So they're aware of the tension in the home, of the arguing that's going on. Sometimes kids are also coerced or forced to be a part of the arguing. Sometimes kids are kind of like used as collateral or used as a form of emotional manipulation. Also, sometimes children are asked to take on the more of a role of a caretaker or parent. So for example, thinking of an older sibling needing to take care of a younger sibling, maybe if it's not safe at home. And then children being afraid to, or intimidation being used. Kids, there doesn't always have to be physical violence happening towards a kiddo for them to be afraid of that happening. Especially because kids are just vulnerable. They're physically vulnerable, right? They're smaller. And this is another really great graphic. I think actually Brennison introduced it to me in one of the first presentations we did together, and I've been using it since. But thinking about developmental impact of childhood exposure to abuse. And I'll name too, so like you can see the link to this is on the bottom of the slide. All of the slides will be available afterwards, and Brandon will give us, she'll give us information on how to request that at the end of the presentation. So just hold tight if you're interested. They're also very accessible on Women's Advocacy's website. I go there all the time. So anyways, you will get access to all of these slides and the resources on them. But taking a look at this graphic, I'm just gonna kind of call out a couple that I feel are especially important. So infant and toddler exposure to abuse, a lot of times we see disruption in those basic biological rhythms. So trouble sleeping, trouble eating, needing more soothing, like crying constantly, maybe seeming colicky, or maybe they cry less, they seem like an easy baby. Attachment is also something we think about a lot. So forming relationships with caregivers, allowing yourself to be taken care of by a caregiver. When there's abuse going on, oftentimes it doesn't feel safe to rely on a caregiver, or caregivers don't feel reliable. But that healthy, secure attachment is a big vehicle for regular development. So when kids don't have that, it can really impact their development. So we can see developmental delays in kids who are exposed to abuse. And then as kids get closer to school age, we'll see more what we would call externalizing behaviors. So they'll show it outwardly more. They might have a stomach ache, they might have a headache, and they might have trouble in school. You might see them being more of a quote unquote troublemaker, being more disruptive, having difficulties with friends. Or you might see them just kind of falling under the radar, being a little bit quieter, trying really hard not to cause trouble. You might see them have social difficulties. They might not have had really positive social interactions modeled a bunch for them. And then you can start to see like anxiety, worries, depression. Kids often have very low self-esteem. Kids have a hard time distinguishing what is their fault and isn't their fault. And so oftentimes kids will worry that they have caused the fighting or the violence, or that they are the cause of it. And then as we get into the adolescent stage, kiddos, you do see more and more of those externalizing behaviors. So more of the acting out, school truancy, delinquency. Kids can start to cope through substance abuse or through sexual activity, more anxiety and depression, difficulties concentrating. Basically, you're going to see these kiddos starting to stick out more. They're going to need more support. And this is a place where we really need to get them support to say, what do you need? And to partner with them on this, because something to keep in mind, and something I'll just go back to throughout this whole presentation, is that I really, really strongly believe we need to approach kiddos with a lens of benevolence. So thinking like, you are doing the best you can with the tools you've been given, but how else can we support you when this is feeling so hard for you? All right, so I'm just going to take a moment and ask folks to throw this in the chat. But how would you define boundaries? What are boundaries? Defining what is me and what is you, social lines created out of respect, crossing a line, setting healthy limits, what is and isn't permitted, limiting what's in my space, a healthy, respectful means of self-preservation, what is and isn't okay, knowing when to say no, loving you but loving me too, protecting yourself, setting where your responsibility begins and ends, knowing what is expected and why, limits on behavior and interactions with others, resources and books, limits to protect your own well-being, Wow, you all are really coming up with some great ones here. I love doing these kind of audience poll questions because you get such a beautiful range of answers. It's really a better description of boundaries than I could provide. A way to teach others how to behave towards me. Yeah, that's great. Boundaries are part of self-care needed to live. Absolutely. Okay, so the definition I came up with at this point was a separation between two or more things. That's like a physical boundary, right? When we think of like a state line. So then thinking about interpersonal boundaries, they're guidelines, limits, or rules we create to keep ourselves healthy and safe. And there's different types of boundaries. So there's emotional boundaries, and the emotional boundaries are how much you can hold for others. And not like physically hold, right? Not like I'm going to pick up a brick for you, but like how much of your emotional burden can I help you to hold before it gets overwhelming? Emotional boundaries might also do with how much personal information you want to share or how you respond to what others share. Maybe you need to stop hearing what they're sharing because it's really hard for you to hear. That's an emotional boundary. Then physical boundaries, that's an easier one. What physical interactions are you comfortable with? What's your personal space? How close can others come to you? What forms of physical touch are you comfortable with? A hug, high five, air high five. And I'm seeing a question pop up in the chat. Yes, there will be a recording sent out. I believe actually all of them are on the Women's Advocacy YouTube channel, which is a fabulous resource. As you can tell, I use it all the time, but Brennison will give us more directions at the end and an email will be sent out. All right, jumping back. So then digital boundaries becoming more and more needed in our current very digital age. So digital boundaries are how you interact with people online, what interactions you have with them, who you engage with, and in what ways. So it might be things like, are you constantly texting with someone? Does that feel like too much? When we think about teenagers, are they being asked to send nudes? I feel like that's a very, very hot topic these days. And then that also feeds into actually thinking about relational boundaries. So what are you comfortable doing with folks in different relationships? What feels comfortable for you in a relationship? And I'm thinking about both platonic and romantic relationships. So for instance, thinking about like, going back to my earlier example, maybe I'm only going to text my boyfriend until 7 p.m., but I'll text my mom like all night long. Boundaries are different for everyone. And then sexual boundaries. So that's which sexual activities you want to participate in, and then which partners you want to engage with in sexual manners. And sexual isn't always physical too. It's emotional. So like what sexual activities feel right for you, and whether or not you can build trust with someone about taking part in sexual activities. And it's also intellectual as well. So thinking about like what sexual activities feel right for you, and does your partner treat you as an equal when you're talking about those? Do they allow you to share your information as well? And then so here's a little question for us to consider for like 30 seconds. Where do we get our boundaries? Where do they come from? How do I come up with what boundaries I have? And so I'm going to partially answer that for you. Boundaries are very often learned. So let's talk about those developmental stages a bit. So babies, I think about that like kind of 0 to 1, 0 to 2. Babies are totally dependent on those around them to set a boundary. Right, so like think of a baby learning to walk. Like you have to set a ton of physical boundaries. Like, no, you can't walk down the stairs. You will fall. You'll get hurt. And babies do not know what is safe or what is unsafe. Think of that baby reaching for a hot stove. They don't know. So we have to set a lot of boundaries for them to keep them safe. And then you have toddlers. And toddlers are still learning about what is safe and is unsafe. So we need to still do a lot of boundary setting with them. But then they start testing boundaries too. Like think about the terrible twos, right? That's all about testing boundaries. Like I'm learning that the grownups around me are setting these boundaries, but why? And what happens if I say no? And so what they're learning at that time is adults set boundaries to keep me safe, and adults are gonna, for the most part, stay firm on these boundaries, but they'll do it in a loving way. And then as they move to childhood, so thinking about like maybe 5 to 11, 5 to 12, they're beginning to be able to they've internalized some of those boundaries now. So we set boundaries and we set boundaries and we set boundaries, and then eventually kiddo learns, okay, I have to be careful on the stairs because otherwise I'll get hurt. So adults teach kids boundaries, and then kids learn to set those boundaries for themselves. So as they're moving into like school age, they're more able to set their own boundaries, but they're also getting into more complex emotional relationships, friends. You're starting to have that kind of quasi like fake dating. You're starting to experiment more with that. So you're really having to learn, like, how do I respect others' boundaries and figure out what their boundaries are, and learning that their boundaries are different than mine. And then finally, as you get into the teen years, they are really kind of in a trial run in a lot of ways for, can I set my own boundaries, and will that be enough to keep me safe? And I often too will reflect the teen years as like very similar to the toddler years, very similar to those terrible twos, because all that a teenager wants is to be independent. They're like, oh my gosh, I'm so ready to be an adult. And the grownups in their life are like, well, kind of, but not really. You actually still need a lot of support keeping yourself safe. But the teenager, again, they're just similar to that toddler. It's, well, why is the boundary here? I'm going to push it, and I'm going to push it, and I'm going to push it. And then I'm going to realize, oh, it's here to keep me safe. And I need to learn to do this for myself. All right, and I've incorporated some audience questions. So we had folks submit questions beforehand. And so we had 2 questions come up here. How do you explain boundaries to a very young child? And how do we teach kids about body safety? We'll talk more about how to discuss boundaries with kids as we continue through this presentation. But 2 resources that I wanted to share. One would be books. There's a bunch of really great books out there when we're thinking about body safety or physical safety. So My Body Belongs to Me. It's a great one. It's a classic. I have a copy that's probably like 30 years old, and it's still hanging in there. So one thing I think about with younger kids is that they need a ton of repetition. Like the younger they are, the more repetition they need. And a great way to get that repetition in is through a book. You read the book and you read the book, and eventually they start to learn those things that are in the book. They start to internalize it. And it's more fun for you to read the book than to just tell them 50 times, 100 times. And then the other thing that you'll see, the other image there is a little body, essentially like a traced outline of a cartoon person. And so another great thing you can do is use those. You could color in different parts, friends can touch me here. Family can touch me here. These parts are only for me to touch. And in that way, really get them thinking about how they're the one who gets to control their body, how they're the one who gets to keep their body safe. And kids respond super well to being in control too. Like they want to be in control of their body. They want to be in control of everything. So giving them that opportunity, that can feel super exciting for them. All right, so we're going to think now about like, what do healthier boundaries in kids look like, and how can boundaries be used as a tactic of abuse? Okay, so how can boundaries be used as a tactic of abuse, thinking both in adults and in kids? So a lot of times abuse tends to push or to ignore boundaries. And those are all kinds of boundaries, all of the ones that we've discussed before. So there's quite often a power imbalance there. So abuse, I'm sure this is something a lot of you say, abuse is a crime of power and control of the partner who is abusive. They are using their power and control towards their partner. So they're using the power to show they don't need to respect the boundaries, and they can control their partner. They'll often kind of just go right over those boundaries to show that they can, to show they have the power to be able to do that. And oftentimes too, people who are abusive can do that towards kids, even if kids aren't receiving abuse in other ways. The kiddos can, the abusive person will really be disrespectful of their boundaries because folks who are setting boundaries and really being able to stick to those, that's a direct threat towards the person who is abusive being able to continue the abusive behavior. And then as well, abuse can often give the message that setting boundaries is disrespectful or is unhealthy. So both people who have experienced abuse and, well, adults and kiddos who have experienced abuse, they might need to redefine or relearn boundaries. They might need to go back to the basics and be like, what is a boundary? How does it keep me safe? Or just doing other forms of process work, really thinking about like what's underneath there. How does a boundary, how does it feel good for me? How does it maybe feel concerning for me? And are there ways that experiencing abuse has taught me unhealthy things about what boundaries are or are for? Oh, sorry, trying to go to the next slide and take a drink, and that did not work. All right, so how does witnessing abuse and or experiencing trauma affect boundaries in kids? So kids who have witnessed abuse are more likely to have difficulty with boundaries, as we had just said. So kids who have witnessed abuse and might not have a super defined concept of boundaries, they might be really seeking control. So they might just be constantly pushing boundaries from adults or from other kids. They might just straight up ignore them. They might follow them sometimes, but other times not be able to. Oops, not quite ready for that. Or they might, conversely, they might want to control everything by really sticking to boundaries, like that kid who follows every rule in school and then gets really mad when other people don't. And thinking too about kids who have experienced abuse very often haven't been able to see healthy behaviors modeled in the past. And so of course they don't know how to have what we would call healthier boundaries because they haven't been shown it like other kids might have been. Kids might also have had to be a lot more flexible with their boundaries to prioritize their own safety. And whether sometimes that's with multiple caregivers. So sometimes it's like, I know I have these boundaries with this caregiver, but then I have different boundaries with this caregiver. Or it might have been like, these are the usual boundaries, but when dad gets mad, I have to do this, this, and this, and that really conflicts with my regular boundaries. So in other times when I feel scared or I feel in danger, I'm gonna do the same thing. And then acknowledging too, so this goes back to that lens of benevolence, but acknowledging that kids are doing the best with what they've been given. So they might not have had modeling of healthy behaviors. They might just be really, really trying to keep themselves safe, even if that's not what it looks like to us at first. And really try and find the positives in kids' behaviors and celebrate it with them. And then talking about working with kids. So I've mentioned these in other women's advocates presentations as well. So this could be a repeat for some of you, but these are a few things that I always try to come back to when working with kiddos and building trust. And I think trust is a really important part of boundaries. So being as honest with kids as you can. So yeah, keeping it developmentally appropriate, right? You're not going to want to give a bunch of details to a 3-year-old. And at the same time, you don't want to talk to a teenager and be like, yeah, that felt scary when the grown-ups use their big voices. That's just going to break trust down more. But really giving them as much information as you can while still remaining developmentally appropriate. So you might tell a kid, a parent who's experiencing domestic violence might say something like, usually, I don't allow people to touch my hair. Last night, Dad was mad, I felt scared, and he did touch my hair. But I still don't like people touching my hair. It was just different last night because Dad got so mad and we felt so scared. And then using developmentally appropriate language too. So that goes back to what the example I had just given, like using language that they can understand, using language that's accessible to them, and kind of seeing it as a work in progress, like always adjusting depending on how kids are taking it. Asking kids questions, listening for their perspectives, allowing them to be an active participant as much as possible. And just, even if it's not something where they can really give input or change the situation, showing them that you value their opinion, you care what they have to say. And in those situations too, you can name we can't change a lot right now, but I still want to know what you think and what you would want to do differently. Like that still means a lot to kids. And then finally, affirming their truths or their beliefs, even if they're different from what you might believe, or what we're told they should, quote unquote, experience or feel or believe, or any of those things. You might have a kid who mom has been really, really unsafe with him and dad, and mom is not allowed to live in the house anymore. And kiddo really misses mom, and he really loves mom, and he wants mom to come back. And that's a hard thing to sit with. But we need to be there to support the kids, to say like, I hear you. Yeah, you miss mom so much. You love mom so much. Even if on the inside we're saying like, oh man, this feels really yucky because I know you were so unsafe when she was here. And then we had another audience question. How do we keep open communication with kids without crossing the boundaries? And I think that's a really excellent, really nuanced question. And so that goes back to it, keeping it developmentally appropriate. So again, thinking about like, is the language I'm using appropriate? Is the content appropriate? Am I sharing things that I feel are appropriate for them to know? But then just continuing to ask for their opinion, continuing to ask what they think, continuing to set the stage, to open the door. You can always come back to me and talk about this. And then if they or if you do cross a boundary, acknowledging that that's okay. Acknowledging like, hey, this isn't something that I want to talk about, but I'm really glad you asked about it, and maybe we can talk about it later. I'm just not ready. Yeah, something that I talk about a lot is like, it's okay to mess up, it's okay to make a mistake, and actually that can be super helpful, as hard as it is and as uncomfortable as it can be for us. So how can adults help kids maintain boundaries? And I'll apologize in advance because these slides are really wordy. I just had a lot to say. So again, you'll all get these slides at the end, so don't worry about reading every word. So I think that the first thing to do is that we need to identify our own boundaries and what feels safe for us, and then moving that to what boundaries we would like for kids to have. And I know I used here the language you would like to have for your child, but this could also be for your student, for your advocacy client, for your therapy client, whatever kiddo is in your life in whatever way. But just really starting with basic questions. Where do I feel safe in a situation? When do I begin to feel unsafe? Or if you've experienced trauma, especially in the context of a relationship, Where do my triggers come out? Because boundaries exist to keep us safe. So maybe like thinking about a physical boundary, when somebody's standing 2 feet away from me, maybe that's when I start not feeling safe. Great, then that's my physical boundary. And understanding that it might be different with different people. You know, maybe this person can be 1 foot close to me, but this person, I don't know them at all. They need to be 3 feet away from me. And that's a basic example, right? But that's kind of how it works with even more nuanced concepts as well. When do I feel safe? When do I start to feel unsafe? There's my boundary. And want to acknowledge too that I think there can be a lot of feelings of shame or guilt as we set boundaries. A lot of things are internalized about like that I should or I shouldn't have this boundary, and really trying to push back against that, knowing that everyone's boundaries are different and that's okay. Your boundaries are based on your experiences. And there's no specific line between like, this is an unhealthy boundary, this is a healthy boundary. Just, it doesn't work like that. As much as that would probably be easier. There's a big gray area there. And then identifying the values that also that drive your boundaries. So what values are behind it? Is it respecting others' space and their choices? How do we help keep others safe as well? And what do you share? So thinking about like, for someone who's a teacher, a counselor, an advocate, so it's not as much of like a family value, but in the space you share with the child, what do you value? So thinking about like, I know that grown-ups have been really unsafe with your body. So like in this space, we are going to be really intentional about what your body boundaries are. You know, so I'm going to think like before I come and sit down on the floor, I'm going to ask you every time. And that's going to be because I'm going to check in on your boundaries, and that's going to be a priority for me. And then giving clear and age-appropriate information regarding boundaries. So that's going back to what we were just talking about, right? Developmentally appropriate and honest. So with a younger child, you might say, you can be mad, but you can't hurt your sister. We don't hurt other people. You can throw the ball instead. So you're giving them a different choice. So stating like, it's okay that you're mad, but here's my hard boundary. We don't hurt other people. Well, and that's kind of the general boundary. My specific boundary right now is that you don't get to hurt, you know, whether it's hitting, kicking, whatever, that is a boundary I'm setting. And then for a teen, it could be, I hear you really want to drive yourself to the movie, but you'll be coming home late and you haven't practiced driving at night very much. I'm going to drive you there this time, but we can do more practicing of night driving. So next time you can drive. And, you know, I always try and wrap it up with a little bit of a bow. So thinking about like, you know, how do we help them understand when that boundary might change? But yeah, so what you're doing is you're saying, my boundary is that you're not driving right now. I don't think it's safe. And I want you to stay safe. So my boundary is that I'm going to drive you instead. And then trying to give kids a specific reason. So again, honesty. So instead of saying, oh, because I said so, you can't have a Coke. Say, oh, because pop will make your tummy sick. You know, or because you've already had 4 Cokes today. I don't know, but trying to give as much specific information as you can. And then modeling. So modeling boundaries, your own boundaries, whether that's emotional, relational, physical. You could say something like, I don't want to be tickled right now. That doesn't feel good for my body. Maybe later though, ask me later. So there you're modeling, this is how I communicate with a calm voice, you know, with a regulated body, that this is a boundary. It's okay, but it is my boundary, but my boundary might change. So check in with me again later. And then, so this is where it's going to get a little bit sticky because I'll say be consistent with boundaries. And then in a little bit, we'll talk about when to be flexible with boundaries. But in general, it is important to be consistent with boundaries. And especially with kind of the underlying thought, you know, like in this family, we don't hit, or I like to hold hands, or I like to high five, but I don't like to hug. Or maybe it's like, hey, we're dating, but I don't like to be texted constantly. That's too much for me. That feels suffocating. Being consistent with those, and knowing that when you set a new boundary, or when you're working with a kiddo who hasn't had consistent boundaries, you're going to get a lot of pushback, and that's a normal part of the process. Kids have a harder time before it gets easier. So oftentimes when you're getting more pushback, that really actually means like, oh, keep holding on to this, because they're actually starting to get it. And then providing warnings and reminders, especially when those boundaries are new, trying to let the kiddo know that it's coming, and to minimize those surprises. Giving them smaller choices so they feel like they're more in control. So do you want to brush your teeth now or in 5 minutes? You're still maintaining that underlying boundary. We brush our teeth before we go to bed, but you get to choose when we do it. Differentiating between then and now. So sometimes it can be confusing for kids when boundaries have been different in the past, and just reminding them, like when you lived with Kevin, grown-ups didn't always listen when you said you were done. But now when you say you're done, we'll listen. We'll say, okay. And then encouraging kids to try it, like, you know, try it. I'll show you. It's different here. And that can be obviously with a whole bunch of different types of boundaries. But sometimes you need to be really, really upfront about it and name that. And then finally, when kids are having difficulty with boundaries, ask yourself, like, what's going on underneath the behavior? Are they seeking control? Is there frustration over something bigger? You know, especially when it's like a little limit or a silly limit, or what might seem silly, you know, thinking about that toddler who's like, no, I want the shark cup, not the princess cup. It's like, is it really about that? Or is it actually about the fact that, you know, grown-ups do everything for you, and sometimes you just want to do it yourself and you're not able to, and that's super hard for you. So another great question we had at the bottom of the screen, how can we support kids of color in developing boundaries? And then another question was, how do I support Black youth? So again, acknowledging I'm a white woman, I am very privileged, and I actively benefit from a lot of systems of oppression right now. So these are the answers that I came up with. I did a lot of research, looked online, and ultimately came from more of a perspective of, like, from a white clinician for other white clinicians. So BIPOC folks, I didn't feel like I was the right person, obviously, to speak to you and your experiences. So yeah, here's what I did come up with: examining our identities and how these influence our experiences. So again, thinking about what we talked about at the beginning, and hopefully what you've been kind of holding as we go. How do our identities influence what we do, both consciously and unconsciously? And then naming what you don't know and asking questions like, oh, I wonder why this is different for folks. This isn't what I would do. This isn't what I learned growing up. Asking questions from parents, from family members, or community members or leaders, folks who have a similar background to the kiddo you're working with. And then really encouraging you to lean into uncomfortability, asking yourself, why does that different boundary feel uncomfortable? And acknowledging that it's important for me to acknowledge as a white clinician that my perspective is often, the dominant cultural narrative is that white cultural elements, which include boundaries, are right and others might be wrong. So really pushing back against that. And when we see boundaries, that are different from our own, acknowledging that that they might not be wrong, they might just be different. And then understanding the effects of societal influences and pressures on individuals from marginalized groups. So how do systems of power affect folks' ability to set boundaries, and how have they responded to that both now and over time? Oh, and I'm seeing someone too saying this also applies to deaf and otherwise disabled folks in positions where they're not allowed to make their own decisions. Yeah, yes, so absolutely thinking about folks from all sorts of marginalized groups, all groups that are affected by systems of power and oppression. Understanding that that folks are often given less ability to say no or to define their boundaries. Again, systems of power and oppression really want to take that power away from people. So understanding that it is going to be really important to folks to make their own decisions, and that we need to give them space to do that. And then understanding too that generational trauma can often be present, that often shapes the boundaries that folks set, and that there are general practices that turn into culture, and then those turn into boundaries. So thinking about things like, how have systems affected the cultural practice, and how can I be knowledgeable of that? How can I be cognizant of that as somebody who's coming in with more privilege and power? And again, very much a developing conversation. And I'm appreciating all the voices in the chat. We can definitely come back to this if we have time. So here's my little joke of the day. Flexibility, thinking about when is it time to let it go, like Elsa. You know, not that I've watched this movie like 50 million times because I work with kids. So thinking about when are some times when it might be okay to be flexible with a boundary. And I'm wondering if we can just take a second and reflect in the chat, like either what are times when you think it might be okay to be flexible with a boundary, or like, have there been times in the past when you have been flexible with a boundary? Either thinking about times maybe when it seemed to go well or when it didn't go well. I'll take a minute for folks to respond. All right, folks, well, if we have more thoughts about when might be a time to be flexible with a boundary, feel free to throw it in the chat. Otherwise, yeah, bedtime flexible, having friends over for a sleepover or on the weekend, absolutely. Yeah. So when you're thinking about when do I hold fast on a boundary, or when do I be flexible with it, ask yourself, so again, going to that question of what's underneath this, or why is this kiddo having difficulty with the limit? What's going on here? Yeah, I'm seeing if a child has had a particularly hard day and they can't complete a step in a routine. Yeah, so understanding like maybe the child is just really, really tired. And so that's another thing that I had named a couple bullet points down. Are there other needs that are unmet? Are they hungry? Are they thirsty? Are they tired? Do they need like some physical contact? Do they just need a hug? Do they need affection? Do they just need someone to tell them like, I love you, I believe in you, you're a good kid? And then what's going to happen if you are flexible or if you do compromise? So physical safety is always the biggest one. Will this kid be physically safe? You know, is my boundary like, no, you cannot go play in the middle of the road? Like, then obviously we're not going to be flexible with that, right? So always keeping physical safety in mind, and then thinking about other forms of safety too, like emotional safety. You know, like you really want to go on a sleepover with someone who's actually been pretty harmful to you in the past, and I'm just going to say no. that I'm going to say not tonight, because I'm really worried it's going to be harmful towards you. And then finally, just encouraging folks who are setting those limits, who are making those harder decisions, to be gentle with yourselves, to know that consistency is important, but at the end of the day, your own mental health and your own well-being is the most important, right? Because it's like you can't really be consistent with those boundaries if you're just exhausted. And if it's really activating, like if it really gets you worked up, to set those boundaries with kiddos around you, I would really encourage you to seek your own support, whether that's therapy, whether that's talking to a friend, whether that is participating in some sort of a nurturing activity, even just picturing or visualizing someone who's been really helpful towards you. And then I'm just going to take a moment and acknowledge that I'm seeing there has been a bit of a discussion. So just, again, we can continue discussions at the end if folks have time and want to continue talking. But I do want to name that systems have, hold on, let me get my words together. So many of the systems existing in American society are designed to oppress people of color, individuals who are non-white, and people who are white can still experience forms of oppression and of power and control, but it's not at the same level, the same frequency as folks who are non-white identifying. So we'd had an audience question, jumping back to the presentation here. How do we set boundaries with kids in trauma states? Really great question. So when you think about a kiddo who is like actively experiencing trauma, who might have experienced a trigger that takes them back to a traumatized or traumatic place, understand that kids who are activated by trauma will often go back developmentally. So your 7-year-old might actually be acting like a 4-year-old. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because fight or flight system will shut down the higher functioning portions of the brain. So like the cerebral cortex, and it'll really just keep the inside parts like the brainstem and the inner workings, the just kind of nuts and bolts of your brain working. So there's a lot less higher functioning available. And another reason is because when there's a trauma trigger that triggers a memory from a while ago, kiddos might actually go back to that developmental functioning. So anyways, just know that when a kiddo is really activated by trauma, that you might have to change your boundaries. You might have to have boundaries with a 7-year-old that are actually more typical of a 4-year-old. You might have to remind them, oh, actually, we're not going to jump on the couch. And it might be super frustrating, right? Because it's like, you know this, we've talked about this, you've known this for years, and suddenly they're doing it again. So understanding that, oh, it's actually because like things are really different for you when you're actively activated because of the trauma. And then kids with disabilities, same way as any other kiddo, just again, really tailoring it to their developmental level. So if a kiddo's development is delayed, then bringing it to them at the level where they're at. You might need to kind of simplify or to break it down for them. All right. So what does healthy emotion regulation look like in kiddos? Being able to experience strong emotions, whether it's really happy, really sad, really mad, but keep their body safe. And this is within developmental norms. So like, we're not going to expect that from a toddler. All sorts of toddlers, like, it's normal for them to not be able to control their body. They're learning how to do it. And that's up to us to set those limits for them so that they learn to do it, right? Referencing what we talked about earlier. An emotionally healthy kiddo is also able to reference adults. So asking questions, having pleasant interactions, sharing joy, just like a parent feeling proud of them, and getting their needs met. Sharing their thoughts, their feelings, their questions openly, and not being able and not being scared or feeling too criticized. And that goes back to trust too. So being able to trust them. And that this also ties into being vulnerable. So admitting mistakes, asking for help, even just saying like, admitting to like feeling sad or feeling mad, all of that stuff. And then referencing their emotions and being able to connect their feelings to actions. Like, oh, I did that because I was mad. Or I'm feeling really happy right now. Just identifying those, that's a big skill. And that's definitely a way for you to see that a kiddo is doing pretty well emotionally. So how do we support healthy emotional development in kids? We can model self-regulation strategies. This is what I do when I'm mad. This is what I do when I'm sad. Oh man, I'm really frustrated right now. What should I do? And letting the kiddo be the helper. That's really fun, especially for the little ones. And then modeling too that sometimes we just have to sit with something. Sometimes I'm just going to feel sad and that's okay. We can't fix it right away. And it's okay to feel sad. And when I need a hug, I'll come find you. Because we can't always fix it right away. So it's important to show kids that it's okay just to hold those negative emotions. And modeling vulnerability. So that might look like saying like, oh, I wish I'd done that differently. When I was mad, I just yelled at you to go to your room. And I wish I had been able to sit down and talk with you instead. Or just talking about how you want to do things in general, talking about times that were difficult for you, or sharing with the kiddo that you've struggled with something that they're struggling with. Like when I was your age, it was also really hard for me to get along with my sister. We fought all the time. Like kids see grownups as so perfect and kind of idealize them. Like it can be mind blowing for them to feel like, what? You also had trouble with that? And then giving them space to feel their big feelings. So like letting them move, letting them run, letting them jump, especially younger kids. Like when they have those really big feelings, they need to physically get them out. And then emotional space too. So like letting them just feel what they're feeling and trying to keep it as judgment-free as possible. And again, keeping in mind like what our own reactions are to how a kiddo is feeling, what we might be thinking in terms of what they should or shouldn't be feeling, but acknowledging that they get to have their own experience, and really just trying to be there for them however we can. And then narrating their emotions and their actions, especially for younger ones, this can be so important. Really helping them to connect the actions to the emotions, so eventually they'll be able to identify it themselves. So like, oh, you're so upset, you pulled all the blankets off your bed. You're feeling so sad and now you're under the couch. Oh, you're excited and you're hanging upside down from your curtain rod. That's a boundary. I'm going to say no. I'm going to help you get down. But just really like, even in those everyday moments, it's connecting actions and feelings so that they're able to do it. So then wondering like, how can boundaries help to support and complicate emotional well-being? So boundaries support emotional well-being. They give structure, consistency, and predictability. And those are all so important with kids, especially kids who haven't had that in the past. Although oftentimes for kids where they're adjusting to having that structure, consistency, and predictability, it can be harder at first. So it can initially cause some big feelings and a lot of pushback. And that goes back to what we talked about earlier about like knowing that when you're getting a ton of pushback against a boundary, that's actually a sign that kids are starting to adjust to it, because they're kind of asking this question of like, are you really going to stick to your guns? Like when the going gets tough. Boundaries also help the child to support them and motivate them to develop trust with their caregivers. And like I'd mentioned earlier, developing trusting relationships with caregivers, whether it's a parent, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a counselor, whether it's an advocate, those are such an integral part of development, both developing a healthy relationship just with an adult or a caregiver, and allowing them to create a space where they feel safe and then they can try new things, take risks, and practice things that they're going to use in their development. Then boundaries also obviously they keep the kids safe. And for kids who haven't always had that safety, whether physical, emotional, both, it lets them just stop focusing on that as much. Like as they start realizing that they are safe and that the boundaries are keeping them safe, it helps them to focus on just let them be a kid, to kind of put down that adult job of keeping yourself safe, of always being watchful, always looking out. And a lot of times too, when we see that in kids, it comes out as looking like anxiety, like hypervigilance, always on the lookout for what's coming next. So you might see some of those symptoms of anxiety, or what looks like anxiety, start to decrease as you're consistent with boundaries. And then it actually, although it seems counterintuitive, it will help the kiddo to allow and to develop flexibility in multiple areas. So as kids learn, like, okay, well, these are boundaries, they're okay, it's always going to be a little bit of a struggle, but but they're safe, and I can trust the people who are making them, essentially. Then kids also learn, like, oh, hey, but actually they also were flexible, on this day and on this day and on this day. And it can help, so that models flexibility for the kiddo in appropriate ways. And it'll help them to be flexible in their own life as well. And then how can boundaries complicate emotional well-being? So we talked about that it can cause emotional dysregulation. And then it can also be confusing for kids when boundaries change. So across settings or across caregivers. You might have, so think between like maybe mom and dad, like boundaries are different at mom's house and dad's house. That can be confusing. Or maybe boundaries are different versus home and school. Maybe things aren't feeling very safe at home and you have to be super protective of yourself. But then when you're at school, things are actually really safe and you can just kind of be a kid. It can be hard to adjust from one place to another. And a lot of times kids don't really show that. But internally it can be difficult for them. Okay, so here's another question for you all. Just throw your answers in the chat. In your experience, which kids have had the toughest time with boundaries? And this can be like specifically a group of kids, or like a group of kids, or a specific kiddo. Those whose parents also have boundary issues. Yep, because then they haven't learned it. Kids who have been abused or traumatized. Absolutely, that makes boundaries a lot harder. Toddlers, yes. Oh my gosh, toddlers. No boundaries by parents, traumas in their lives, kids who are chronic runaways. Yeah, that's a lot of trauma there too. Kids who have never had them by their parents. Youth victims of sex trafficking, absolutely. Again, haven't really had much modeling of safe boundaries. Kids of parents with substance use issues, yeah, because those parents aren't always able to be around consistently as much as they would like to. So then the boundaries aren't kept consistent either, and kiddos can have really a hard time with that. Yeah, thank you all so much, and feel free to keep throwing them up there if you think of more. Yeah, kids who were abused, certain cultural norms too. Okay, so this is another graphic I really like to go back to, thinking about what can be the impact of childhood trauma, and looking at all these different things. I think it just, well, let's take a second and look at all these and think about how they can relate to boundaries. So cognition, difficulties with cognition, delays in cognition, language delays, difficulty in concentration. Like maybe it's just that you're not understanding what people are saying when they set a limit. Maybe you can't remember it. Maybe you can't focus on it while they're talking. Physical health, trouble sleeping, trouble eating, being sick more often, shorter lifespan, and that goes back to the ACEs study. I totally blanked on the name there. If any of you are familiar with that, which was a kind of a groundbreaking study showing that kids who experienced multiple traumas have poorer physical health. So yeah, if a kiddo's not sleeping, not eating, like it's going to be harder for them to remember a boundary, to follow a boundary. Emotions, all sorts of difficulty with your emotions, that is going to make it a lot harder for you to follow a limit, or maybe you might push back against a limit on purpose because you're mad and grumpy, or shame and guilt, feeling really worried, feeling hopeless, or feeling like you don't have control. All of those things, like, well, then where's your motivation to follow a boundary if you're feeling like everything's hopeless? Difficulties with relationships, so difficulties forming that trust, difficulty seeking affection and attention. All of that would make it, well, less motivating to follow boundaries, and also just more difficult to follow boundaries, especially in relations. Like it might be really inconsistent. You might be kind of pushing a boundary and then respecting it and then back to pushing it, just because you haven't had that modeled. And then mental health kind of goes closely with emotions as well. Behavior is pushing a ton of boundaries, right? Like a lot of things that are kind of set for us as safety. So a lot of like acting out language, sexual acting out, aggression, poor self-regulation, drug and alcohol use, all of those things are limits that are set pretty standard. And then the brain development piece, yeah, absolutely. And I saw that somebody mentioned that in the chat too. So a smaller brain size, less efficient processing, an impaired stress response. So all of those things can make it harder for kids to follow boundaries. So basically what we're getting at is that development, when kids experience trauma, it can really, really cause an impact on their development and their ability to follow boundaries. So how do we support these kiddos? First of all, coming at them with benevolence. So something I'll repeat often is you were doing the best you could with what you had. And that's so true for these kiddos, right? Another thing you could say is that you were doing what you needed to do to keep yourself safe. So understanding that, like going back to the last graphic I just had up, well, I can do that. I forgot I could do that. Going back to this, like looking at the far left-hand side, the behavior. So sexual acting out, right? I'm just gonna switch back. And I just pulled that as an example, but you're seeing a kiddo who's having a lot of what we might define as risky sex, not using protection, maybe not finding out about partners. Like going back to like, why is it that they're doing that? Understanding that kiddos, that they are doing the best they can with what they've been given. So maybe that's the way that they know to experience affection. Maybe they haven't had consistent relationships with caregivers who could have taught them like different ways to get affection, different ways to feel loved. And so that's how they meet that need now. Also modeling hope, show them that they can be different. So I had talked earlier about differentiating between the then and the now. So being like, things were like this when you were here, now you're here, now you're at this different place or in this different environment, and things are different here. And even if that's, again, for a kid who things are really up in the air, if it's like, yeah, things are scary at home and like you need to do a lot of things to keep your body safe. Just remember when you're at school, like there are grownups at school who keep you safe. So really differentiating between that and giving them hope to like, it can feel different here and that's okay. And it's like, I know that it feels hard for you, but it's going to start feeling better. Just giving them that hope. Sometimes folks who've experienced trauma, especially like a chronic trauma, really have trouble feeling hopeful about it. And then too, when you're having difficulty with boundaries, take it down a notch. So take a couple steps backwards developmentally. Maybe what you're doing is too challenging for them. Maybe there's some sort of a trauma trigger going on that you're not aware of and they're developmentally backwards. Or maybe that limit's just hard and like giving them something easier to try would feel a lot better for both of you. And you can also try like breaking it into little pieces. Leaving the playground is hard. Maybe we're just gonna get off the slide. And we're going to celebrate that because that's going to give them pride. That's going to give them a sense of achievement. That's going to give you something to celebrate. And that's going to help to break out of a shame spiral. A lot of times kids will get stuck in thinking, I can't do this, I'm no good, you know, like thinking that maybe that all they do is push a boundary, although I'm sure they don't use that language. So find a way for them to be successful, celebrate it with them, show them you think they're such a good kid, and keep on going. Start building like a pride spiral. And to recognizing that, like, so the celebrating the little things too, just acknowledging that that's not perfect. So like that example, like you're just gonna celebrate them getting off the slide, right? They followed that limit, but then you might still have to carry them out kicking and screaming. Like, it's not perfect. It's still gonna be hard for both of you. And it takes a long time, and that is hard. It's hard work. So I want to acknowledge that. All right, so there's a couple of things that I used as references here that are linked. And again, Brandon will give us some information on how to get these resources. But I'm gonna move to this slide. So this is the end of my presentation right now. So I have my contact info up there. Feel free to reach out if you've got any questions. But I did see that we had a couple questions. We had a couple questions coming. Oh, okay, yeah, I see that okay, perfect. So folks, if you do have questions related to pretty much anything, feel free to pop it in the chat or in the Q&A function. Otherwise, Brennan, do you want to jump on and kind of give folks instructions about if they're looking for an attendance certificate or like a copy of the slides or whatnot?
Absolutely. 1 second. I didn't spotlight myself earlier. I don't know if you can even see me, but I just sent a link in the chat for a post-webinar survey. So feel free to please give us feedback. Let us know if there are any other topics related to this that you would like in the future, maybe things that really stood out to you that you enjoyed, any feedback that you would want us to know. Feel free to fill it out. It should also pop up once you close out of the webinar. And then I just sent information on how to request a certificate of attendance for this event. So you'll want to email outreach@wadvocates.org and send the information. Make sure you include the name as it should be displayed on the certificate. And then everything else will be in the follow-up email that should come out tomorrow morning. It takes some time for the recording to process and also get uploaded to YouTube. So I appreciate any patience and kindness that can be afforded with that. But huge thank you to Mary and our ASL interpreters as well for this incredible event. I know I learned so much, and I hope you all did too.
Thank you so much, Brennan. And I did spotlight you, so hopefully that worked.
Thank you.
Oh, technology. Yeah, but a huge thank you to our wonderful interpreters for putting up with my fast talking and weird I don't know, weird expressions, I guess. I did see that we had one question pop up too. What can you do when children come from a different culture and do not share the same boundaries and levels of limits from their culture? Yeah, that's such a good question. So I think part of it is being very curious with them, both with them and with their parents, right? Or like other folks who are in their culture and really wondering like, like we talked about earlier, what are the values in this culture? What is really important? And then if it is something where we can't entirely honor those boundaries, can we still try and keep those underlying values? You know, so maybe it's like, maybe the family is a really important value in this culture. So can we find another way to celebrate the family, you know, even if it's like, if this specific limit requires us that we can't have the whole family together? And that's just kind of coming off the top of my head. So it's definitely not perfect. I think another thing to do is just to acknowledge it too. To say like, hey, this is what we're doing right now, or this is what the rule is. It's different from how it is at home. And that might feel weird for you. Is there a way we can make it better? Is there a way you want to change it? But at the same time, like obviously you still have to be the final decider. You're in charge of keeping them safe in all sorts of different ways. And then I think too, another thing to do when you run into that problem is trying to start more of an agency-wide discussion, a policy discussion, like, hey, we ran into this and it seems like there's some cultural conflict. Like what work can we do as an agency or as just like thinking about a larger team, maybe like to be able to learn more and maybe to more easily reconcile these in the future. So thinking about the bigger picture and if there are ways that we can be proactive about it.
I have some resources for that as well that I will add to the chat if people are curious. And I also recommend that you all sign up for our next webinar event, which will be kind of very similar to these topics of how do we interact with people who are of different cultures than our own. We're having a panel on a conversation for supporting the mental health wellness of Black women. And so there's a lot of different information that will come up from that. So I would definitely recommend you register for that if you haven't already. So that will be on the 21st of May. I will add that to the chat now. So it's definitely one of those things that's an ongoing conversation, right? And not just something that can be answered in just a few minutes too. So I appreciate you all bringing that to the conversation as well too. I see there's a question about reaching out to treatment centers. If anyone works at a treatment center and wants to attend our webinars, they're of course welcome to attend. But if you mean something different than that, feel free to message or email us as well. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I think we'll let you go early, which is an anomaly for sure. But
no,
I appreciate you all so much and thank you for participating. We'll go ahead and close out the webinar.